I'm Ruth Westerby. I'm at the Centre of Yoga Studies at SOAS, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Lee to speak with us this evening. So in a departure from our usual offerings on yoga's history, practice and philosophy, really broadly construed, usually we draw on the disciplines of Indology, philology, and at times ethnography and art history. Today we're expanding disciplinary outlook and turning to human geography, in particular geographies of the body. Dr. Jennifer Lee is a human geographer and senior lecturer at Exeter University. Dr. Lee works broadly on geographies of the body with a particular interest in yoga and meditation, spiritual landscapes, spiritual authority and habit. She's been working on the embodied labour of yoga teachers construed through aesthetic, atmospheric and embodied labour. So Dr. Lee has published widely in articles and book contributions, and I really checked them out. There are some fascinating offerings that she's published. She's got work on understanding therapeutic massage as a form of body work and the energy body, mindfulness meditation and habitual geographies. She's written on Ashtanga, negotiating authority in the teaching and learning of Ashtanga yoga, and looked at Iyengar yoga, liberation or limitation, reading through Foucault and Deleuze. She's got contributions as well on spiritualities and on touch. So tonight's presentation is approaching yoga through the lens of work. It's entitled Emotional and Atmospheric Labour in Contemporary Yoga Teaching. I was very lucky to catch a presentation on some of this work that Dr. Lee presented at the University of Ghent recently, who had a symposium on gender and diversity in contemporary yoga. So I'm absolutely delighted that Dr. Jennifer is speaking for us this evening, and I hand over to her. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you for your introduction, Ruth, and thanks for inviting me to speak. It's really exciting. So tonight I'm going to speak about some recent research on the work that yoga teachers do. This extends some of my previous research on modern postural yoga in the UK, which, as Ruth said, has looked at the relation to the self that yoga affords, the forms of authority that might exist within teacher and student relationships, and the experiential states brought about by attending yoga classes, among other things. The research I'm going to talk about tonight is grounded in feminist perspectives on work, which argue that labour is a sensuous living activity that makes subjects and worlds. In general, work is intensifying, increasing its temporal, spatial and psychic reach into the lives of workers. This has multiple and complex impacts on worker well-being. Of course, work can have positive outcomes, including financial reward, experiences of satisfaction, creativity and fulfillment, and the creation of individual and collective identities. It can also have negative effects, including making stressed and overwhelmed body minds and disempowerment, disillusionment and exploitation. So tonight I'm going to focus in depth on the actual working practices of yoga teachers in order to try to pick apart and understand the work being done, both on the mat and outside the class. Firstly, I'm going to look at the relationship between yoga and work and outline the conceptual frameworks that have been used by social scientists to understand embodied service labour. After a quick consideration of methods, we'll then explore the emotional and atmospheric labour that is being done before concluding. So why is work a productive lens for developing our understandings of modern postural yoga? The numbers of yoga teachers are growing exponentially. So Ipsworld did a survey in 2017, which suggested that there were 15,000 yoga and Pilates teachers in the UK. And I would argue also that yoga teachers do a really significant job in holding society together in loads of different ways. But there's really no research that enables us to understand the work that's being done, the conditions of that labour, and how it impacts upon the workers themselves. And I would argue that yoga teachers are a really interesting case within the broader category of embodied service labour. While yoga teachers might, on the face of it, be understood maybe alongside personal trainers and gym instructors, for example, so putting bodies into shapes, there is, as you will know, really much more going on. Yoga teaching involves embodied labour, but in conjunction with a complex combination of other kinds of work. For example, constructing an appropriate spiritual or physical body, freelance business-related work, education, self-development, etc., etc. And one of the major questions I've been working with is whether yoga is kind of different in some way. Is it just another site in which the intimate spaces of the individual are problematically colonised by capital, or is there something else going on? A second interesting element of the work of yoga teaching is that the kinds of bodily knowledges that are integral to yoga teaching, for example, energy, for many people sit outside the realm of the believable or acceptable. As I've argued elsewhere, I think there's value in taking bodily knowledges such as energy really seriously because they shape material working practices and spaces. This challenges social scientific accounts of what might be seen to be knowledge. In doing this, it kind of legitimizes things that might be less easy to formalize, are anomalous, or that really push at the fringes of the definite and the limits of the believable, but which are nonetheless really central to the work being done. This ties into broader feminist arguments for the valuation of the kinds of work that might not be seen as work in masculinist models of labour, which generally value the production of something tangible and measurable. So a third interesting aspect of yoga teaching that I want to mention here is the highly gendered forms of precarious and flexible labour that characterise contemporary yoga teaching. And I found the framework of do what you love labour useful here. So this has been more generally used to conceptualise the creative industries, but I think it has value here in understanding yoga teaching as a form of work that involves much more than just wage exchange. So do what you love work has been coined to talk about those jobs which are framed through passion. The literature argues that this framing often undermines the actual conditions of labour. As Tokumitsu puts it, when passion becomes the socially accepted motivation for working, talk of wages or reasonable scheduling becomes crass. There's lots to unpick here, beyond which I have scope for in this talk. But yoga teaching absolutely could be seen to be done through love, often a career choice made in response to other less lovable work. But it also can be characterised by rather unlovable conditions, as Sandoval puts it, including low pay, part-time work, precarity, and the need to assemble a portfolio of jobs or to be supported by a partner. Right. So hopefully my screen share is working. So having set out the key reasons for why looking at work enables us to begin to unpick the relationships between kind of gender and yoga and to kind of understand yoga, I want to outline the conceptual framework for the paper. So embodied service labour has been understood in a number of key ways by geographers and sociologists, including so emotional labour, which is around the kind of emotional management of the worker, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a moment. Effective and immaterial labour, which is kind of about informational and creating a kind of cultural, environmental, sort of tangible affects, including body work. So this is about body on body work. It can be sort of care, it can be massage, and quite often it's kind of involving sort of bodily dirt, involving touch and kind of physical proximity, and also aesthetic labour, sort of using the physical capital of a body to create desire in the customer to kind of make them want to have that body as well. And I think, you know, actually any of these can be useful for understanding yoga teacher, but I'm going to focus on emotional labour tonight. I think this is a particularly useful framework because it helps to shift assumptions that might exist around yoga teaching as being kind of just putting bodies into particular shapes. And it signals towards the wider range of kinds of work that are being done under the name of yoga teaching. So, oh, there we go. As some of you might know, emotional labour was introduced as an idea by Arlie Hochschild in her book, The Managed Heart. While the idea was developed in relation to cabin crew, it's an important part of a wide range of different kinds of typically feminised people work. So emotional labour refers to the work of producing and suppressing certain feelings in the worker in order to produce or suppress certain feelings in the consumer. And today I'm particularly interested in how emotional labour happens. How does the worker manage to present themselves in the way demanded of them? So Hochschild argues that there are two main mechanisms. The first of these is surface acting, where the true feelings of the worker don't match the outward expression. There's a degree of kind of disguising what is really felt or pretending. The second is deep acting. This can result from kind of ongoing surface acting. So here the self is deceived as much as the consumer. The internal feelings are modified in order to match the outward expression. So there's kind of change happening in the body of the worker because of this ongoing acting. So here, capital reaches to the very heart and soul of the worker, as Kathy Weeks puts it, and recreates the worker subject according to the demands of the market. So a number of problems have been seen to emerge from this penetration of capital, including emotional dissonance, where workers become separated from their actual feelings, and emotional suppression, where particular feelings are inhibited. More broadly, this speaks to an estrangement from our feelings as they're rooted in the service of capital, wherein we don't or we can't feel in our normal ways anymore. Our feelings are more directed towards others rather than kind of being located within ourselves. We can't listen to our feelings in the same way, and where, as this quote suggests, emotions themselves become changed. They're stretched into standardized social forms, so the range and scope of emotions becomes lessened. And this has broader consequences like emotional burnout, feeling phony, or having to deal with consumers' distrust because they detect inauthenticity. So a number of questions have been framed around this conceptualization of emotional labour, and I'm sure kind of lots of sort of emerging in your heads as I talk about this. But they include the question of actually, whether having your feelings commodified is intrinsically alienating, the question of how far emotions can be commodified, and the suggestion that emotion workers exercise a significant degree of emotional free choice. And I think that, without really interrogating the wider relations within which the labour sits, it's hard to assess this. So there are limitations, but I think it serves here as a useful framework to understand how work happens in emotional registers, and also to politicise understandings of emotion at work. So I want to speak briefly about the methods I used. I used in-depth interviews, and I spoke to 20 yoga teachers based in the southwest of England over the summer and autumn of 2019. So I recruited teachers via yoga studios, via gyms, via their personal websites, and kind of using my own local knowledge of teachers and studios as well. And the teachers I spoke to were in a range of positions. So from like getting their entire income from yoga teaching, doing yoga teaching alongside other work, teaching in different settings, and with a range of different levels of experience from less than a year to more than 20 years of teaching. And the focus of the interviews was the actual working practices of the teachers, following Angela McRobbie's assertion that this is a feminist strategy that enables us to value the actual work being done. Of course, this is a really limited sample of teachers. The way they range across different settings, different forms of yoga, different experience levels, makes it quite difficult to systematise the data. But I do think that in-depth interviews provide a rich set of insights into the working lives and practices of the teachers interviewed. So I'm now going to move on to look at the work being done through the lens of emotional labour. So one of the things that I asked in the interviews was how the yoga teachers present themselves to their students. The presentation of the self, kind of how they might embody a particular identity or presence, is one place to look for the doing of emotional labour. When I asked the teachers about how they were able to manage themselves in order to be able to do the work, a range of responses emerged, some of which correspond entirely with the conceptualisation of emotional labour outlined above, and some of which are quite different. So, for example, this male teacher with 5 to 10 years experience describes a form of imposter syndrome that he experiences and how he deals with it. So he says, imposter syndrome rears its head quite often. I ask, well, how do you deal with it? He says, just sheer force of will, repress, push it down, ignore it, which isn't particularly healthy, but I let the emotion out later. So if I'm feeling something particularly acutely. So this is a form of emotional suppression where the outward expression and inward feeling don't correspond, so that students don't see the uncertainty, which, if they do see it, it may well impact on their experience of the class. This teacher performs a form of surface acting, able to embody an agentic relation to their feeling. They push it down. There's an element of self-mastery here in relation to the broader feeling rules or emotional norms that govern the work that the teacher does. Within the small sample of interviewees, this was an isolated case. So he was the only person really that told me anything like this. And it, both in terms of the very clear articulation of the feeling of imposter syndrome, and also in this performance of dissonance between inner experience and outer expression. So other teachers told me less about this kind of in the moment acting and more about the work that they did around the class to enable them to teach. So for example, here, a female teacher who's been teaching for 5 to 10 years described how if she isn't feeling 100% before a class, she's able to use other mechanisms to bring her up and change how she's feeling. So she said, I just have a bit of quiet time from going from one thing to the next thing and having that space in between. I find it really helpful. And then I can notice if I'm feeling a bit grumpy or feeling a bit whatever, a bit tired, I think, okay, well you do. So why don't we just deal with that now? And then we'll go through the class feeling a bit better. So rather than just forcing myself to be something I'm not really feeling, which again, I find more draining. So she uses meditation or just actively reflects on what's going on for her before the class, so she can deal with it rather than force herself to be something she isn't actually feeling. So this is perhaps more clearly aligned to the deep acting that Hothschild outlines, but there's perhaps a less kind of agentic deception involved. Here rather, there's something else going on, which works more with the feelings happening rather than trying to change them directly. So another approach is outlined here by a female teacher who's been working between 2 and 5 years. She undoes the idea of acting and emotional manipulation further as she describes the need to be honest about her feelings. So she says, I find to be a really authentic teacher or really teach at my best, I have to be, I guess, honest as well. I had something really difficult going on with my partner at the time, and I just thought I have to tell people this because I can't just sit there and pretend that everything's okay, because that's also not the message that I'm sending. And I find that authenticity is what is incredibly powerful. So again, I think it's valuable to take note of the context. Jenna was talking about an experience at a retreat, and this kind of honesty might be possible in a retreat, but not in a drop-in class. But it's important to note that this idea of honesty is aligned with a more authentic relation with the students. And this unpins from the notion of acting that is at the heart of Hothschild's framing. A different model of emotions emerges where there isn't necessarily a difference between inner experience and outward expression. So there are a range of different relations to emotions here and different performances of emotion, and also a spectrum of yoga teacher identities. Although what I haven't interrogated is what the range of appropriate yoga teacher identities looks in practice. Strictly speaking, this might give a clear steer that what is happening isn't in fact emotional labour, or at least as Hothschild frames it, and suggests that we might look elsewhere in order to understand what's occurring. But before doing this, I kind of want to explore whether the idea might need rethinking for a contemporary context, and whether actually yoga teachers kind of offer a really useful way in prompting that rethinking. So one of the things to think about is the wider labour relations within which this emotional labour occurs. The framings offered by Hothschild refer to someone who is employed by a corporation, wherein estrangement occurs because you're putting your emotions to work in the service of an employer. If we take framings such as do what you love seriously though, we need to understand contemporary emotional labour as occurring outside of this corporate framework. In the case of yoga teachers, they were most often self-employed rather than working for others, although there are more complex arrangements with studios acting as gatekeepers, teachers being employed by studios, although they often don't have a contract or employment rights as such, or where corporations such as MoveGB or ClassPass mediate the relationship between student and teacher and charge the teachers for this service. And actually, you know, no one has really answered the question of whether the self-employed can even be subject to estrangement, although some work by Rachel Lara Cohen, a sociologist of the body, has begun to explore this. So another thing to think about, I think, is how societal emotional norms might have changed, how this affects the work being done through the emotional register. If what emerges is a kind of emotional authenticity or honesty, then maybe this can be usefully located within a broader regime, or within the spiritual milieu, at least, where all emotions are valid and validated. For example, as this female teacher with 2 to 5 years of experience suggests, one of the things she does as part of her work is a form of role modelling, where her self-presentation to the student isn't, I'm an expert and I've got it all together, but rather is more like, I'm going to be honest and sit here and tell you that I feel that my emotions are all over the place right now. Hopefully by saying that, people allow themselves to feel like that too. So looking at these changing emotional norms from the perspective of the teacher is important, as there are consequences that arise from this kind of authenticity. One of these is a kind of disconnect from the market logic, as these quotes from teachers at both ends of their careers, so they're both female, one with 20 plus years experience and one with less than 1 year experience, show. So Bryony says, I guess the way that yoga is different to other jobs is that you can only offer what you do. Like you are yourself, you can only teach your version of it in the style that works for you, and that's got to be okay. Not everybody is going to love that, and not everybody is going to hate it. Sonia says, I've put a lot of money into my training to unfold myself, and I've chosen to come into teaching, and I suppose I value what I do. And if people want to come to my classes and pay that, then I'm creating my own tribe, the right tribe for me. If people are not interested, they don't have to come. So here emerges a clear sense that the teacher can offer what they can offer. There's no point in trying to offer something they are not. And I think this authenticity relies on a model of the self that emerges from the yoga itself. So this is kind of folding into that question of, you know, actually, is yoga different? Is there something kind of quite distinct going on here? As this teacher, who is female with 2 to 5 years experience, notes, everything is already within you. You already have the divine within you, and it's about weaving your way back to that essential sense of wholeness within yourself. So what she's essentially saying here is that there is no need for someone external to work or manipulate the emotions of either teacher or student to ensure a particular good or pleasant experience in the yoga class, as everything you need already lies within you. This wholeness for this teacher kind of underpins the ability to present themselves authentically. So what we're taught at Yoga Teacher Training School is the full essence of this becoming whole again. And so we're put through our paces massively. We do things like we do family constellations as part of our training, deep therapeutic work. We're taken deep down into becoming the person we want to become, remembering who we are, so that when we step on that mat, we're offering a true, authentic experience to the students which come into that room. I think it's important to point out this is a very particular school of yoga which doesn't by any means represent the range of different perspectives that exist or that came up even within my interviews. But it's a particularly clear articulation of the logic of the emotional that exists here, which isn't characterised by a deficit in the same way that the conventional model of emotional labour is, where the worker and customer always need to be feeling something different from normal within the space of consumption. However, this is not to say that becoming a yoga teacher doesn't involve change, as articulated by this teacher. So Sonia, with 20 years experience, says, you know, my job as a yoga teacher is to be constantly developing as a person, to be constantly taking myself through deep practice. My physical practice, my emotional practice, my energetic practice, my mental practice is constantly required to be deeply attended to, so that when I step out on the mat in front of these people, one, I'm able to hold a very safe space so that people are able to explore very deeply what is happening for them. And two, when they come off that mat, I'll also be able to hold them to a certain extent afterwards. So here a model emerges where the job of being a yoga teacher involves continual self-work. There isn't the same separation between the person outside and the person inside work, and this differs from the kind of deep acting outlined by Hothschild. So deep acting gives rise to lasting change in the worker, but it comes about as a result of the work, according to the logic dictated by capital. But here, the change is a precondition for the work, and the impetus for this change comes from the self and also from the teacher's teachers. So at the same time, it's important to think about the student's emotions. In Hothschild's model of emotional labour, the responsibility for the consumer's feelings lies at the feet of the worker. So it's their job to make the consumer feel good. In contrast, here, the consensus was that it was the responsibility of the student to do the work themselves. The teacher might be kind of making the conditions for this to be possible, but they weren't directly working on the feelings of the student. So as this teacher says, you know, I'm here to keep people safe and to help them on their own process, but I'm not the process. I'm a teacher, I'm not an instructor. So she's very clear about this. She says, I really, really despise it when we're referred to as just instructors. We're not there to instruct, we're there to invite. If you get an invitation, you don't have to open it. And if you open it, you still don't have to come to the party. It's your choice. You're coming onto that mat and you're choosing to come there. So here the teacher outlines with real precision her role. She's not an instructor at the front telling the student to do things, but rather she's issuing an invitation to the students, and it was their responsibility to engage with it to whatever degree they wanted to. So it is undoubtedly about inner experience, but not necessarily the positive experience that Hothschild outlines when she talks about aircraft cabin crew. A broader suite of emotions are recognised to come out of the work, that students might feel challenged, they might feel upset, they might feel undone, and that's okay, as it's all part of the work. I can make everyone just have the most lovely, relaxing time, and that's not for me. My yoga practice, it's not a place of comfort and relaxation, it's a place of inquiry and health and well-being. It's a place of understanding and honesty. Okay, so where does this leave us? While we might be able to argue that the norms and mechanisms associated with emotional labour have changed, it still seems that something else is perhaps going on. What emerges through the interviews is a sense that what the teachers are doing is making a set of conditions for the students themselves to do the work. As this teacher with 20 years experience notes, for me, it's about creating a safe space for people to explore themselves. For me, it's rule number one. You're unfolding a lot when you work with the body. You're not just physically cutting shapes, you're touching your emotional body, the mental body, the physical body. So for me, it's about creating a safe space for people to let go and unfold. This idea of creating the conditions for the students to do the work was articulated in a number of ways, including holding space and creating an atmosphere. And this notion of atmosphere coincides in really interesting ways with the atmospheric turn in geography and also the wider social sciences, and has led me to begin to work with the idea of atmospheric labour. Although, you know, I'd be kind of wary of mapping directly the conceptualization of atmospheres that the yoga teachers work with directly onto these academic conceptualizations. There's kind of more unpacking and more interrogation to be done. So atmospheres are seen as part of a wider turn to understand how life is organised outside of strictly representational registers and structures of feeling, as Anderson and Ash put it. Atmospheres have been defined as distributed yet palpable, a quality of environmental immersion that registers in and through sensing bodies while also remaining diffuse. In the air, ethereal, as Derek McCormack puts it. The turn to the atmosphere is part of a broader sense that the immersive has replaced the spectacular in contemporary capitalism. So this means a kind of shift from cultures of looking to cultures of corporeal involvement. You can think about the ways in which audiences in concerts kind of become part of the performance, or I suppose on a smaller scale, the growth of things like escape rooms. In general, the question of how atmospheres are generated has largely been approached through environmental manipulations, including the design of particular spaces, sensory manipulation, kind of lighting architecture, all of those kind of things. And I think, this is understandable because the very idea of atmospheres is to kind of unpin from human agency a bit, to think about actually how we can think about atmospheres having a sort of life of their own, which kind of does resonate with bodies, but isn't just reducible to bodies. I think as well, at the same time though, if we ignore the way in which human labour is involved in shaping or generating particular atmospheres, then we're really kind of risking devaluing the work being done, and also missing out on the potentially exploitative labour relations which might frame this atmospheric labour. So I'm going to use the rest of my time to think through the atmospheric labour that yoga teachers do. So this quote from Jane shows how they intervene in atmospheric registers by the way they present themselves in the room. So she says it's about stilling the energy when I walk into the room. So if I'm there on time, it's about sitting and sitting quietly, and sitting maybe even with my eyes closed so that doesn't necessarily encourage the energy to stay up here. There might be a conversation, but then when the conversation, right, okay guys, we're in yoga now. And so it's maybe what I do, not necessarily what I say, but what I do, bringing myself into stillness, bringing myself into quietude, which then goes out. So we might begin to interrogate the load of doing this work, of the work of generating this stillness, of bringing the right self to the room, no matter what else might be going on in the teacher's life. There are still imperatives that exist here, as this quote from Abby suggests. You're setting an atmosphere, so you yourself have to feel very composed so that you can then transfer that to the people in the room and create a very relaxed atmosphere where they feel comfortable. Circling back round to the very first quote about imposter syndrome, there can still be disjunctures between the presentation of the self and the inner state of the teacher that can be costly. So Bella says, yeah, it does feel a bit weird sometimes to be waxing on about being mindful and calm and trying to project this aura of serenity when you're rushed off your feet, you're dehydrated, you haven't eaten properly. We might also want to situate this labour within the different conditions that play into the ability to successfully do atmospheric labour, the sensory qualities of the space, the interruptions to these, the ability the teacher has to change things within the space. So I really love this quote from a teacher. I love all the quotes, they're all brilliant. But so she told me about this. She says, the actual space where I teach is a very noisy gym. It does not have complete full floor to ceiling walls, which just kind of is gobsmacking. So she's teaching in this room. It doesn't have a complete separation from the actual gym. You're separated from the gym, but you can hear dance music that's playing in the gym, weights that are clanging. Sometimes if it's very busy, you can hear a lot of masculine grunting, which is not very yoga. And I don't have it all as easy with a beautiful wooden studio, lovely kind of whale music and a nice diffuser, which would be my choice, don't get me wrong. That's what I like, but I feel as though I'm bringing more to it in the gym class, weirdly enough. There are costs to the kind of self that the teachers cultivate here. This is a radically open, intuitive and empathetic self, which carefully and skillfully responds to the needs of others. There are undoubtedly costs of working in this register, as this teacher Sonia notes. You do sometimes get people who are like energy vacuums. It's almost like you can see it in your peripheral vision. There's like a black hole in the class, and it's really difficult because they're the people who need to be held and need to be in that class and to be in that protective space, because there's often stuff going on with them, but that can be difficult. I think it's important as well to note that the atmospheric labour is never just individual, as the atmospheres are felt and made perceptible by the other bodies in the space. In the instance above, the teacher might need to mediate somehow the black hole, so they don't suck the rest of the class in, or they might need to do work to bring the right bodies together. So Sonia says, I rock up to this church hall. It's cold, the sun's on the floor, and I love it. The space is awful. It's dreadful. I have to sweep the floor. It's a nursery by day, so it's a seriously messy hall, but everyone knows it. We have to do poses where, and I'll be like, if you don't mind the sand, put your hands on the floor, but if you don't like the sand, keep your hands on your chest. It's not actually, because it's not my space. I don't have ownership of the space, so we're having to make it up together. And probably I'm thinking too much that I create that atmosphere. So because I don't feel responsible for that space, I rock up. I try and make it as nice as I can, but so do the other students. I've got a few old ladies that come. They often get there before me because they sit and have a little chat and they sweep their bit of the floor. So we're all sweeping the floor together. And that was a really interesting interview because she had a beautiful studio. We did the interview in her studio, but she's still kind of teaching in this church hall, and she kind of talks about it in terms of like actually keeping her real, making her kind of reflect on the work needed to create the atmosphere rather than just letting her space, beautiful space, kind of do it for her. So this gestures towards something else, which would be a different paper in itself. But the yogas frequently outlined how the specificity of the fact that the work they were doing was yoga mediated or in some way undid the potential negative effects. So this teacher says, the energy is two-way. It's not just me holding the class, but you know, if I hold the class appropriately, the energy comes back. In my teacher training, we were told you should not be tired at the end of the class. You should be energized at the end of the class. And that's about this energy exchange. I kind of look at all my classes as a conversation which can be verbal or non-verbal. Okay, so I want to bring this to a close. And you know, I think I've talked about a lot. There's a lot I could say to conclude. But I kind of want to return to the reasons I gave at the beginning of why work might be, I think, a useful lens to begin to understand modern postural yoga. So thinking through the lenses of atmosphere and the emotions offers really important insights into the kinds of work that might not be seen as work within masculinist models of production. I have no doubt that some conceptual framings would brush off the work done in creating an atmosphere as somehow made up or not skilled or really not very important. What I want to argue instead is that we actually must adopt conceptual frameworks that attend to the excessive, to the ambiguous, to the challenging nature of such realms of energy and atmospheres, and also to develop an understanding of how these various bodily knowledges relate to material working practices. Working with that which is generally taken to be beyond belief is necessary if we are really to properly attend to and value the kinds of work that are being done and which are also growing in economic, societal and individual significance. You know, this is work that really matters. I think the second was how yoga teaching sheds light onto the kind of lived contradictions between doing a job you love but in unlivable conditions. The focus tonight has been the kind of sensuous living activity of work. And actually, you know, the conditions of that labour were more or less obscured. Nothing, I didn't really talk about that. But this sensuous living activity needs to be situated within the forms of juggling and struggle that characterise the working lives here. The ways that teachers assembled their teaching alongside other work, or how they relied upon the income of a partner or a spouse to make their chosen work financially viable. And Tokumitsu notes that do what you love labour disguises the fact that being able to choose a career primarily for personal reward is an unmerited privilege, a sign of that person's socio-economic class. And this, of course, maps directly onto the broader debates around body fascism, about decolonisation, and what an appropriate body might be for a yoga teacher. All in all, the work being done by yoga teachers is complex. It challenges the conceptual frameworks that currently exist for understanding forms of embodied service labour. And, this is furthermore challenged by the pandemic, where yoga studios have been closed by lockdowns, are currently closed by lockdowns. A variety of responses have emerged from teachers, some of who have just stopped working altogether. Others have shifted their work online and worked from home, having to move all their furniture around in order to do so. While some studios have now opened, reopened, shut again, the business model of full studios where students are arranged in close proximity and the teacher is often in close proximity doing hands-on adjustments has been disrupted, and who knows when we might return to that. The pandemic has raised a whole set of new challenges about doing yoga teaching as a form of work, including the increased load around stress, care and well-being, the new forms of labour that are being done, like working online, also refiguring embodied labour in a time of social distancing, and the impacts of doing this kind of work. And I think this, really demands some further research into how the working lives of yoga teachers are kind of being refigured under a future living with COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Can you hear me okay? That was great. Tour de force. Well, I was wondering, it's obviously a long way away from my world of Sanskrit, but you were sort of intimating that some people might not even consider being a yoga teacher as work, teaching yoga as work. Are there any actual concrete examples of that? I can't.
I suppose
it seems to be similar to teaching what I do in some ways.
Yeah, I suppose I'd probably kind of look at that from two perspectives. One, in the interviews, actually, some of the teachers were like, but it's so nice, it's not really work, it's just kind of like being kind, caring for people, it's just kind of what you do, it's just a kind of normal, human characteristic. And so actually, I think actually that is kind of saying it's not really properly work, and it's not quite valuing the care, the kind of the work being done to construct a self that can respond in that kind of generous and nice way. So I think there's something around there. I think also I'm probably saying this with half a head in economic geography, where work is like business suits and elites and that kind of work, and
so you were talking about imposter syndrome, weren't you? I suppose it's more that in the people well, I don't know if it's more that, but the people doing the teaching perhaps feel that it doesn't quite count as work. But I think that you'd probably say that about anyone who feels lucky to do the job that they like doing.
I think there was a real split. There was a real people really strongly articulating that I've trained for this. This is my life's work. I take it very seriously. It's absolutely really hard work. I value myself. I should be valued. And then I think, there's real differences. People who've just started out teaching, feeling maybe a little bit wobbly, trying to find their way, having a class at kind of 7:30 on a Friday morning and like no one coming, and kind of like, that's a hard situation to be in, and the kind of the flooding. I live in Bristol, and actually the Move GB was the kind of impetus for beginning to do this work, really. The ways in which suddenly you don't have a yoga teacher, you have like there's a market where you can pick people on an app and you can just kind of go according to your schedule, so you're not having a relationship with a teacher, and that kind of drop in kind of culture, I think changes things massively. So I've kind of gone off.
Okay, so Move GB, that was an app that enabled people to do that. Okay, that sounds bad. Sanskrit teachers everywhere. I've got a few questions rolling in. First up is Theo, please.
Yes, sorry, I'm going to use a host privilege to ask a question myself, and that is, as we have, I know you're a human geographer, but as we have a geographer, I'm really interested in space and how space interacts with the kind of agency of people within that space. And I was really struck, you mentioned it really briefly at the beginning, of how yoga teachers are kind of engaged in the work of holding communities together in different ways and holding those kinds of negotiations. And I'm struck by the similarity between that and how many of the spaces you're talking about are also community spaces in which negotiations happen between different people. And I wonder if you kind of have any insights or thoughts about that, kind of the way of yoga teachers being the glue in those spaces in different ways, or the accommodation within those spaces, if that's making any sense.
It makes loads of sense. I have no insights about it, but it's fascinating, and exciting, stimulating. I mean, I suppose, you know, the way in which I kind of recruited people was through studios. So I suppose my kind of focus was on studios, and like how do you go about, well, see, now I'm saying that, there was a kind of particular interviewee who absolutely kind of did, so she worked outside of the city, she was kind of working in a more rural setting, and talked very much about kind of church halls, village halls as kind of where she was teaching, the kind of being a, a form of kind of glue of holding people together. And she talked about, the work in those spaces being quite different from the work in the studio that she was doing in central Bristol. Beyond that, I don't think I've got much more to say, but it would be lovely to go back to my interview transcripts and ferret around along those lines. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So we got a few anonymous, but we got one from Ruth first of all. So if we could go to Ruth, please.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks for that really fascinating presentation, Jennifer. I've got loads and loads and loads of questions, but I just wrote one down because I'm only allowed one. Yes, it was, what's the you said you were going to do a feminist reading of the labour market, and then towards the end you referred to like a more masculinist reading of the labour market, and I wondered what the difference between those perspectives were, whether that was anything to do with that in a feminist reading the commodity is emotion, as you've been discussing, and whether and in a masculine reading it would be around remuneration.
Yeah, interesting question. I think I'm probably definitely oversimplifying the debates. I'm not an economic geographer, and actually, I never really thought I'd be interested in this field of work. But then I was like, well, hang on. Oh, it's really interesting. Hello, thinking about, I suppose I have kind of thought about work, but it really indirectly throughout my career, or kind of coming at work from a slightly different angle. I mean, I don't know, actually, I kind of think that feminist readings would be about the entanglement of emotion and remuneration. I think it's about the value of work. I think it's about questions of how to live well through work, and that was kind of, this was a failed grant application, and I decided, I'm going to do the research anyway because it's really interesting, but the way in which I framed it was through kind of the feminist writings of J.K. Gibson Graham, and thinking about how do we begin to kind of live well through work? Is living well through work even a possibility? And it's that sense of kind of the real complexity of working in the service of other people's well-being, but then that can be really difficult. My sister's a yoga teacher, and one week she had a job and the next week she didn't, and it's like, oh, hang on, that's really violent and brutal. You know, talking to people who are doing full-time jobs and, yeah, you know, trying to kind of develop their teaching career on the side, and just being totally overwhelmed and exhausted, and you know, it just is like, how is this good, how is this proper? The mediation of the market by kind of Move GB. I know, so I suppose the, you know, the kind of traditional economic geography model would be, yeah, look at the kind of corporations, follow the money. I think probably the feminist reading would be, hang on, you know, how is this enacted through bodies? What are the kind of, you know, I mean, like, love what you do labour, precarious labour, massively gendered, emotional labour, massively gendered, the things around, you know, oh, it's just being nice, isn't it? That's massively gendered. It's a, you know, it's a characteristic that is kind of attributed to females. The, you know, the contemporary kind of labour market within yoga teaching, massively gendered. And, you know, I think I'm talking in, this is why it's good for me to think through things in small detail with interview transcripts rather than tell big stories, because those big stories are possibly a little bit skewed. But, you know, thinking about the kind of, yeah, different relationships you might have with male teachers, female teachers, thinking about the work around kind of gurus and, you know, kind of difficult power relations. I've again kind of spiraled off into, I'm not very good at sticking to the topic, sorry. But yeah, I think, you know, I think those feminist readings give real purchase to think about the ways in which kind of doing well-being work can actually result in people not being terribly well looked after, which is a bit sad.
Well, I don't know if I can cheer you up with the next question, because it rather leads on slightly from that last one. But during your research, have you encountered notions of healing, in inverted commas, scare quotes perhaps, as being part of a yoga teacher's emotional work?
Oh. Really interesting. So this is really interesting because it makes me think, so I've done research in the past about massage and yoga, and I remember in that past research, someone who was also a yoga teacher and a massage practitioner, she was like, well, you know, massage, yeah, you're kind of doing the work for them. Yoga, they're kind of doing the work for themselves. So, you know, that resonates, I think, with the kind of quotes that I talked through. I don't think anyone mentioned the word healing as such from recollection, but I do have a terrible memory, so I'd need to go back to my transcripts. But I think, you know, that sense that emerged of actually, where does the question of like, where does the responsibility lie? You know, does it lie with the teacher or does it lie with the student? I mean, I suppose, you know, you could argue it's kind of distributed actually. But this clear sense that actually, you know, you can invite them to, I love that quote, you can invite them to the party, they don't kind of need to turn up. It's not my responsibility to do the work for the students. I just kind of hold the space, I kind of create the environment. I suppose like another way to look at it would be absolutely the notion of kind of like healing would be part of the yoga teacher's work, but it would be that would be, you know, healing the self. That would be the journey that they would need to kind of go on in order to be able to kind of be a yoga teacher, have the right kind of, you know, characteristics or the right kind of presence. And, you know, as soon as you kind of begin sort of picking, like, yeah, you know, one of the yoga teachers was like, oh, you know, have you thought about doing yoga teacher training? I was like, well, I don't know if, you know, I don't really feel like, you know, I'm good enough or I've done enough yoga or, you know, whatever. And she was like, well, you know, don't do it unless you're prepared for your life to change radically. She kind of went on to talk about, you know, how the people on the teacher training course had changed jobs, had got divorced, had moved, you know, it was a kind of disruptive force doing the teacher training, like really productive. But that kind, I suppose, you know, in that respect, then yeah, absolutely healing, but kind of self-healing was massively part of the yoga teacher's emotional work.
Okay, thanks. So we've got a bunch of, well, actually I'm going to shout out, some of these are not questions, they are just sort of random statements, and I'm not going to read some of that, but there are a few questions in there as well. So in the first one is, in your view, are there any other professions that demand similar levels and patterns of emotional labour?
Oh, I'm sure there are. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, there definitely are. What would they be? You know, I suppose there definitely would be. I think probably, you know, what am I trying to say? Gather myself, right. So yes, absolutely. I think probably the framing of the idea of kind of emotions, the framing of the kind of relationship between, you know, worker and consumer might be according to different models. And I suppose I'm kind of thinking about, you know, psychotherapeutic practices. You know, you can look at the work of like Nicholas Rose to kind of think about the kind of levels and patterns of emotional labour that go on kind of, you know, within that sort of regime. I suppose, you know, meditation, like, you know, mindfulness meditation teachers, I would imagine would be doing really similar amounts of emotional labour. I've got a PhD student who's looking at, Chloe Asker, who's brilliant. She's looking at emotional labour. Well, she's not looking at emotional labour, but she's looking at the kind of labour of doing, you know, becoming a mindfulness teacher. Like probably, you know, primary school teachers, doctors, you know, oh my God, like higher education staff at the moment, massively. Yeah, so it's probably everywhere.
Yeah,
I'm sure it's everywhere. Yeah.
Did any of the teachers emphasize any type of Indian philosopher or ideas during the classes?
So that's really interesting. Like one of the things I sort of didn't ask them was kind of like what kind of teacher they were, which is probably a bit silly, really. Probably should have done that. You know, like what, I mean, they, you know, some of them would kind of tell me. What I was really interested, and I don't know why I was surprised, like I shouldn't have been surprised at all. It should have been really obvious, but it wasn't really until I talked to the teachers, was the kind of level of, like, you know, part of the work they were doing was reading, was engaging with literature, and, you know, actually some of it might have been, you know, old yogic texts, but, you know, other things, other texts would have been, you know, like The Body Keeps the Score, you know, kind of more modern kind of books. But, you know, and I'm not, it's not my area of speciality at all, but they, you know, they were all reading, they were all thinking, they were all, it really struck me how intellectual the work they were doing was, and I hadn't sort of seen that coming, which, yeah, feels a bit daft of me, but, you know, the engagement was fab, loved it, clever people.
I've got a quick question coming from a position of extreme ignorance about all this, but are there sort of yoga schools? You said that, I think you said that basically everyone was self-employed. Yeah, is that right? Pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much.
Are there any big sort of organisation yoga schools that look after their teachers, or everyone's out on their own all the time?
So I suppose, yeah, I mean, I think there are, absolutely, and that can work, you know, in different ways. I think it can be kind of positive, but it also can be sort of exclusionary for other people. So one of the studios, training schools, very much was kind of training. It was very much a kind of, this is the teacher, we are training you kind of in the model of the teacher, that particular teacher, in order to teach in our studio. And that was a kind of, you know, a lot, it was the kind of the quote that I sort of said, actually, you know, this is not kind of paradigmatic, or this is not, you know, characteristic. So yeah, there was a very kind of close knit, you know, holding of particular teachers together to teach at this particular studio where they had trained. So there's a kind of, I suppose, a buying into that, you know, life. There's other studios, like kind of franchises, where you have to go and do the training with the franchise in order to teach, you know, at the franchise. So I suppose that's kind of sort of the same, but maybe different.
But they're not then going to put you on a salary regardless of how many students you get.
No. So I mean, yeah. So I don't think anyone really got a salary, but, you know, there were definitely different relations in terms of, you know, some studios would pay per class, regardless of the number of students that came. Other people, you know, they would pay a higher fee for the space, and they would collect, you know, according to the number of students they had. Other people did it through MoveDB, where it wasn't 100% clear how the calculation was done, or like it wasn't just, you know, the student would pay £6 and the teacher would get £6. It was very complex and kind of unclear way in which the payment was made, which people found really problematic. So I think, like, other than that one studio, like actually a lot of the teachers I spoke to also had kind of set their own studios up. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think there's, you know, it's really complex to think through the different kinds of.
There is one space in which it does happen, which is in institutional settings. So if you're brought into schools or colleges or prisons or places like that, then sometimes those can be on a more formal kind of employment style basis. But it's very rare in as far as my research goes, it's very rare.
Right.
Outside of those spaces.
That makes me think, actually, because yeah, some of the teachers I spoke to were employed by a university, not the one I worked for. You know, yes. Oh, the students aren't here that week because it's exam week. We're not going to pay you. Okay.
So that's the other thing, is that yes, are you paid by? Sometimes you can get a decent set fee per session, but it's still per session rather than, yeah. There's no sick pay. There's no benefits. There's no one of those things.
No. Yeah.
Okay. We've got an anonymous question here. Love what you do, Labour is surely the province of the middle classes. Is class a factor in the demographic you've spoken with in your research?
Oh, massively. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because there's high financial costs related. There's a high financial barrier to yoga teaching. You know, maybe some of the teachers supported themselves and their family on their yoga teaching, but really not very many. I can't think, actually, I don't know if any of them did. So yeah, absolutely, you know, and I think there's all sorts of things about one of the things I'm interested in is the kind of, you know, appropriate bodies to be yoga teachers, the notion of kind of aesthetic capital, the sweaty Betty leggings, you know, yeah, it's expensive to be a teacher. You're going to, you know, your own teacher as well. Some of your classes might not make any money. It's not Yeah, it's massively classed, massively classed. Yeah,
Okay.
massively.
Easy question, that one then. This one might be harder, but well, it'd be hard for me. I would have to write a book about it or something. But you presumably have considered in your methodology the answer to this question, which is, how do you define yoga?
Well, I defined yoga, I suppose, you know, in thinking about how teachers define it. So yeah, it's not an easy question at all, is it? No, that's fine. You're right, it's not easy. And you're right, there would be books to write about it. There probably have been books written about it. So the teachers called themselves yoga teachers. I recruited through studios that, you know, were yoga studios. Most of the teachers I spoke to were basically, you know, teaching asana practice. There wasn't that much kind of, you know, the other limbs of yoga going on. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just self-definition then. If someone calls himself a yoga teacher.
There we go. That's a nice, really succinct answer. I could have given that answer, but I didn't.
Okay, next one, another anonymous. Is there a comparison between yoga and other types of teachers, university, high school, etc., in terms of emotional and atmospheric labour? Or I suppose, has anyone made that comparison?
Well, we made that comparison when we were talking about it in the interviews, I suppose. So yeah, there has been bits of research done about the kind of emotional labour that teachers do. So Elspeth Probyn has written about that. She's an Australian body theorist. I think no, probably not in terms of atmospheric labour, because I don't know that anyone else has talked about it. I need to write the paper before someone else starts talking about it. But you know, yeah, absolutely. That is kind of what we do as university lecturers. It was interesting thinking about when I was talking about this tonight. There was another kind of voice in my head going, "Oh, isn't it quiet?" Oh. And you know, when you're in a room with people, they move and they breathe and they, you know, rustle their papers, and it's like there's no atmospheric labour going on here. I can't extend it out the screen, you know. But yeah, absolutely. If I'm in a, you know, yeah, if we're teaching, or yeah, absolutely, that's what we're doing. Yeah. So I need to write the paper, basically.
Yeah. Own that category.
I do. Yeah.
Own that concept. Right. Yeah. We've got someone from in New York City, apparently, NYC, Radha Devi Om. So she has named herself, so we can hopefully go to her if possible.
Wow.
Is that going to work?
Hello. Yes. Namaste.
Hi.
Hi.
That was really interesting, Leah. Thank you. I just wanted to ask you, would you ever consider doing this research in New York to compare against Britain?
Oh my God, that'd be amazing. And actually, I suppose, you know, my mind's kind of thinking, oh, well, you know, yes, but I couldn't even get funding to do it in Bristol. But you know, I suppose actually there's no reason why you couldn't you couldn't talk to yoga teachers over Zoom. You know, I suppose that's the advantage, isn't it, of the pandemic, thinking about how different ways to do things. But I think, I mean, you know, I'd be really interested to hear what you think about the kind of New York kind of, you know, yoga labour market. You know, I suppose on the grapevine you hear kind of difficult things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's definitely very different vibe. When I did come to see my parents, I would go to Indaba in Marylebone in London, and I think the yoga vibe in London is a lot more traditional, spiritual, reverence to the actual India, you know, closer to the classes you'd get in India than what you get in the States.
Oh, interesting.
And I think here it's very cutthroat.
Right.
It's very cutthroat. There is, oh, I should be paid this much. So going on to that question, James, about payment and, you know, how should yoga teachers be paid? Some are very, we should do it free. Yoga should be free. And some is, no, I should get $100 an hour for each class. Some are celebrity yogas who are in a good $250,000 salary. Some of us are barely making it to pay rent.
Yeah.
And it is a fascinating topic, that yoga for free or not, can you get rich? Are you meant to be poor? And then the emotions, students, they put a lot. When you said about you should come out, when one of your candidates said that they should leave the room more energized.
Yes.
Sometimes I don't, because my students really drain me with all their crap. They expect me to fix it.
Yeah. Really interesting. And isn't it this New York that the kind of move to unionize yoga teaching is kind of coming from?
Is it you know? Well, no.
I might be making.
Oh, you mean about the Yoga Alliance?
No, there is New York, but it's specifically Yoga Works. It's the Yoga Works chain. They have a union. So it's the first formal kind of yoga union. But there's also one coming together in the UK. But
Is there? Fascinating. Fascinating. Hooray for unions.
And I look forward to you doing it in New York.
Oh, thank you. That's, really interesting. Would be really interesting.
We've probably got time for one more, which is another anonymous one, so I shall try to make sense of it. So if teachers are employed, do they have, it kind of builds on from the question I asked earlier about whether, you know, you can get work for a sort of organization. If teachers are employed, do they have institutionalized or organized possibilities? For example, supervisions, I'm not quite sure about, I suppose maybe if they are supervised, to exchange on their experiences or seek support. Sounds like someone calling for a unionization there.
Yeah.
Might be a bad idea.
So again, that like kind of particular, I think it really depends on where they're working, the kind of networks they're in. You know, one of the things I was really interested in was this kind of sense of kind of mutual support. You know, is it competitive, or do people kind of bolster each other? Or no pun intended. That particular studio that I talked about before, the one where they're kind of training in a particular lineage, it's a particular kind of yoga, I'm not going to name it. They're teaching, they're learning to teach in that studio. So supervision was part of that model, actually. Yeah, absolutely. But other than that, it's a spectrum. I think some teachers felt they'd gone and done their 200 hours training, and then they were kind of let loose on the world, and they were like, I have no support, I feel really disillusioned, this is really difficult, how do I get classes, how do I get people in those classes, how do I do this on my own? So yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I was really trying to get at, and I didn't quite, but I would like to kind of follow up, is the kind of difference, because I'm a geographer, the different local communities of yoga, and sort of like how they were different. So initially the proposal for this was to do some research in Bristol and to do some research in Edinburgh, because they've got yoga, I've forgotten the word now. There's a studio which, what's the word? Can't remember. It's not helpful, is it? But it's a kind of different economic model, I suppose, which can't remember the word for. Begins with a C. No. I'm normally, it's near bedtime.
You're not by any chance talking about Edinburgh community yoga, are you?
Yes, I think I am.
There you go.
Yes, thank you. But it's like a different model. It's a kind of community interest. It's so I'm kind of interested in, anyway, long story, long story short, I'm kind of interested in the context around support, around what difference it makes being a teacher in London or a teacher in, I don't know, Halifax, you know, or a teacher in Totnes. You know, what does that kind of local context do for the experience of being a teacher? You know, one of my kind of grander ideas is to do a survey, kind of national survey. Again, that was in the unfunded project, but you know, it's something I'm kind of thinking about to get a kind of picture of how this kind of plays out across the UK, I suppose. What levels of support are there? What's it like being a teacher in different places? That kind of thing. The importance of networks, the importance of kind of social capital, the importance of kind of, yeah, being in with the right people. So that's kind of, yeah, taking it a little bit away from that notion of support and supervision, but yeah.
Okay, great. Well, we're over time now. Thank you very much. We have got another question, but I think we should
I think I've run out.
let you go.
I've run out of steam. I've run out of steam, I think.
It's a long evening. It's 7:45 here in the UK.
Only Wednesday. I don't know what day of the week it is. Yeah, we're all sat at our screens forever. Well, thank you so much. There's clearly going to be a lot more to do on this topic.